Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. How should we interpret the recently released economic results? What should we make of the fact that India has overtaken Britain and is now the fifth largest economy in the world? And what are the steps and reforms needed to boost India's growth? Those are three of the issues I shall raise today with the country director of the International Growth Centre, India's former chief statistician, and one of the country's most highly regarded economists, Pronab Sen. Professor Sen, let me start by asking how you view the state of the economy at the moment. The government is proud of the fact that quarter one saw 13.5% growth, but if you compare quarter one of this year with the pre-pandemic quarter one of 2019-2020, then the economy has only grown by 3.8%, which comes to an annualized 1.3% over 3 years. And that's not a great performance. So let me start by asking which of the two is a more accurate way of looking at the economy?
Well, Karan, that really depends upon what is it that you're trying to get a handle on. If you're treating the entire epidemic and its aftermath as a minor aberration, then the right way to look at it is to look at it over a 3-year span as you're doing, and you'll get actually 1.1, it's not 1.3. However, if you accept that the pandemic was a once in a lifetime event, it has left permanent scars on the economy, which nobody could do very much about, then the pace of recovery from that level becomes important.
Which of the two ways is your preferred way?
My preferred way is actually to see what the rate at which we are growing from the low that we had hit in 2020.
Does that mean you incline towards the 1.1% annualized growth over 3 years?
No. It would be what's happening to the economy relative to 2020. I mean, we took a massive hit in 2020. There was a lot of destruction of production capacities simply because of the pandemic and our response to it. And now we really have to track how quickly we are coming out of that.
Let's then focus a little on that 13.5% figure for quarter one.
Mm-hmm.
To begin with, it's substantially lower by 2.7% to the RBI forecast of 16.2. And secondly, even that 13.5% figure is fairly substantially boosted by a base effect. So do you agree with the business standard which says, and I'm quoting, the growth rate of 13.5% is in fact a clear disappointment?
Yes, because remember, the first quarter of last year, which is what the 13.5% is, was negative growth. So if you look at 13.5% in terms of how much you've done over and above what you would have done had you not got negative growth, it comes to only a little over 4%.
Right? So you are disappointed by 13.5%?
Yes. However, if it had been 16.2%, then you would have gotten year-on-year growth of roughly 5.5 to 6%, which is what we should be looking at this.
But we've got year-on-year growth of roughly 3.8.
Yeah, roughly 3.8.
So you're disappointed.
That is a disappointment.
Now, in fact, as this financial year progresses, the base effect will steadily dissipate to the point at which it almost disappears. The RBI itself has accepted that during the second half of this year, growth will be around 4%. So given the disappointing start to quarter one, can we really achieve the RBI figure of 7.2% by the end of the year? Or is that looking increasingly unlikely?
No, remember 7.2% again is a statistical artifact. But if you just listen to what we said, it was 4% if we correct for the negative growth of last year, right? And it's going to be 4% for the rest of the year. So the stable growth over this year, this financial year, will be 4% on the corrected base.
Well, this is very important. You believe that the rate of growth that will be achieved for the year ending March 2023 will be 4%.
4% in real actual terms, right? But because you have 13.5% in the first quarter, right? When you do the averaging over the year, you will get something close to 6.5, 6.6%.
So even if you do the averaging with the 3.5% as the quarter one figure, you're not going to hit 7.2. That we're missing for sure.
That you're missing.
So what you're saying, and I'm just putting this in simple terms for the audience, the 7.2% figure that the RBI forecast for the year as a whole is almost certainly not going to be met, will be somewhere between 6 and 6.5%. But in terms of real growth, the economy will have achieved 4%.
Roughly.
And real growth is what matters, not the statistical variation of it.
That's right.
So real growth by March 2023 will be 4%.
Yeah.
And that is a disappointing figure for a country like India.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on what your expectations are. And that's something we can
But
perhaps
we certainly
talk about.
need more than 4% growth.
We certainly need more than 4% growth. I mean, whatever exercises have been done earlier, and those need to be revisited now, about the rate of growth we need to keep our expanding workforce employed is a minimum of 6.5%.
We'll be well short of that.
We'll be well short of that.
So the rate of growth we require to keep our expanding workforce employed, i.e. jobs for the people coming on the market, will be well short of it by almost 2.5%.
Yes.
To what extent, and I suppose this is almost a rhetorical question now, but to what extent will we be helped, or will the global situation not give us any boost at all? For instance, interest rates are almost certain to remain high for the foreseeable future. Because of the geopolitical tensions, commodity prices, including oil, are likely to remain elevated. And because of the problems economies are going through in Europe and America, I take it the potential to boost exports from India is very limited.
Yeah, partially. The prospects for the rest of the year don't look that great because the global economy is in trouble, and we are far more integrated into the global economy than we acknowledge even today. Now, in the situation that we are looking at, the redeeming feature is that because you're going to be seeing weakness across wide swaths of the global economy, commodity prices will come down. And that's almost a certainty. Even with the disruptions.
Will they come down to the $75 per barrel level that our budget is based upon?
It could.
Is it likely?
It certainly could.
So oil could come down.
Even other commodities.
Particularly if we use
because
cheap Russian oil.
the point is that the supply shock is already behind us.
But interest rates will remain elevated.
Interest rates will almost certainly remain elevated. So there's a downside which is coming from the interest rates. There's a downside which is coming from a potential weakness in our exports, which have been a driver of growth up to now for the Indian economy.
But there's an upside possibly from oil.
From oil. And so unless our domestic consumption and investment activity picks up strongly, we will be seeing downward pressures.
I'll come to that in a moment's time, because when I end the interview, I very much want to ask you what it is the government needs to do to step up growth. But let me, for the sake of the audience, sum up what we've achieved and established so far. A, we're not going to achieve the RBI target of 7.2. We're likely to come in somewhere between 6 and 6.5 at best. Secondly, if you look at real growth, actually we'll be achieving 4%, which you pointed out is roughly 2.5% below the growth we need to find jobs for the people coming onto the market. And that is really bad news for India, because unemployment and joblessness is a major concern.
Yes.
And therefore, there is a real case for the government to take steps urgently. And I'll come to that in a moment's time. But let me first put this to you. The business standards conclusion is the following: the growth momentum in the economy is significantly lower than believed. The paper is suggesting we have a growth problem. Would you agree?
Well, everything depends on what they mean by believed. Yes, the growth momentum is weak. It is weak relative to what we need. As I said, what we need is at least 6.5. What we're going to get is about 4. If we are really lucky, we may get 4.5. I doubt it. So yes, it's weak.
Hidden in that answer is a thought that occurs to me, which I want to put to you. The growth momentum is weak relative to what we need.
Yes.
And what we need is what's going to provide jobs for our huge population.
Absolutely.
But the flip side is that the growth momentum may still mean that we are the fastest growing big economy. The two can happen together and not necessarily contradict each other.
No, this is true. But unless you have a very high degree of schadenfreude, this should come as no pat on the back, because everybody else is doing worse.
That's another very interesting point. The fact that we are the fastest growing or the biggest growing big economy actually only means that others who are big are not doing as well. And there's an element of schadenfreude in the pleasure and pride we take.
That's right.
However, the message from the government, particularly the finance minister, is repeatedly, we are the biggest growing or fastest growing big economy.
Well, factually, that's correct.
But what she's overlooking is that in terms of what we need, which is the more important way of looking at economy, we're 2.5% lower than what we should be.
This is correct.
So rather than take pride in the fact that we are the fastest growing big economy, she should be concerned by the fact that we're 2.5% below where we should be.
That's right.
Let's then come to that critical question. What is it that the government should do to get us back to the rate of growth we need to create the jobs we need?
Karan, that's not obvious. Because frankly, if you look at what the government has done, they've done nothing which is egregious. Most of what has been done has been actually in the right directions. The problem is that the rest of the economy is still not responding. And unless we have a diagnosis of what the nature of the problem is, why is the private sector in its larger sense not responding to the government initiatives, is really the question that needs to be asked. And I'm afraid that question is not being asked.
But you're saying something very depressing, and I'll come after that to the question you think we should ask. We're doing all the right things. We're moving as far as policy measures are concerned in the right direction, but the economy is not responding.
This is right.
In other words, it's not that the government is failing to act. It's the economy that's failing to respond. Which is particularly worrying.
Yes, it is worrying.
Then come to that question that you asked. Why is the economy not responding?
My personal sense on this is that one of the sort of driving features of the Indian economy has been the play of entrepreneurship in the country, which has really driven the Indian economy forward. My sense is that over the last 2 years, that the entrepreneurship probably still exists, but the supporting structures to let that entrepreneurship play itself out, I think, has been steadily eroded.
What are these supporting structures?
Supporting structures, for instance, think about entrepreneurship as I'm trying to describe it here. This is about people who are starting new businesses. And I'm not talking about the startups as the term is used today, but small activities, medium-sized activities, people are starting up and then taking to the next level. Much of this was actually supported by the informal credit system. All right? That informal credit system is in deep trouble. The overall flow of resources into the formal financial system really has taken away a lot of funds from the informal, which means the older sources of funds for small startups is no longer as active as it used to be.
But why has this informal credit system dried up?
Demonetization was one big reason.
It's still affecting us.
It's still affecting.
And the other?
And then the lockdown. So during the lockdown, there was a huge amount of MSMEs which actually just died. And they probably didn't pay back anything to their creditors.
The Indian Express had an article recently that suggested that something like 16% of loans given as credit guarantees to MSMEs had turned into non-performing assets.
Well, that's not surprising. It's a little worrying, but it's a worry of a different kind. And let me explain why, because I think it's important to understand this. Post the lockdown, the part of the MSME sector that actually survived, and this was a large chunk, were MSMEs who were essentially ancillaries to corporate India. Those MSMEs survived and survived well. A lot of the credit guarantee loans were to these enterprises. Okay? Now, the reason I'm worrying about this number that you're quoting, the 16% default, is it the case that corporate India is now starting to get more vertically integrated and are stopping the orders that they used to place on the ancillaries? Is this the reason? We have no evidence at the moment that this is what's happening.
But if it is, it would
But
be
if
bad
it
news.
is, that would be bad news.
What is it that the government should do to get this informal credit system flowing again?
There is not much that the government can do in itself. Most governments tend to focus on formalizing the credit system. And our government has been doing this for many years.
Focusing on the informal credit system is difficult for governments to do.
To encourage the informal system is difficult. It's impossible for the government to do.
So we have a paradoxical situation. We know what the problem is, but we don't know what to do about it.
Quite. I mean, it's a difficult thing, because what we are really talking about, and the heart of the problem, is that employment in India is created by MSMEs.
And if they aren't
working, employment is not going to happen. If employment doesn't happen, growth isn't going to happen.
Absolutely. And that means people will stay poor, they won't earn.
That's right. And the consumption will not therefore grow.
And if they don't spend, there'll be no incentive to want to invest.
That's exactly right.
So we're into a vicious circle spiraling downwards at the moment.
Potentially. We're not there yet, but potentially we could.
One of the problems you mentioned was this blocking of the informal credit system.
Yes.
What are the other problems that mean that the economy is not responding to whatever the government is doing? What are the other reasons it's not responding?
The thing is that one of the things that we find which is a little worrying, is that the transport sector continues to be very weak. So clearly the kind of distribution systems that we had, so transport sector is by and large goods transport. Passenger transport is relatively small. There's a great deal of weakness there. I think the transport sector is now still double digit.
15.5% below pre-pandemic levels.
Now, that in itself should give you a hint to what's going on. That if you cannot distribute your goods, or you cannot get your inputs coming in, and remember, these are not people who are placing bulk orders. They would be doing it maybe by the truckload.
So if transportation isn't happening, goods aren't moving, buying and selling isn't happening, and the economy isn't turning over.
That's right.
Let's at this point then look at critical sectors of the economy, because we may discover, as we look at them one by one, that we discover areas where the government can take remedial action which might help. And let's start with the sector you mentioned: trade, hotels, transport, communication, and broadcasting services. This, I'm told, accounts for something like 30.5% of all employment, but it's 15.5% below pre-pandemic levels.
This is right.
That is particularly worrying, isn't it?
Well, at one level, yes, it is worrying. At another level, you can see it as an opportunity. I mean, after all, we were consuming these services, right? So there's ample scope for growth.
It's only an opportunity in the sense that we know that we have to boost it by 15.5% to get back to pre-pandemic levels. The problem
remember, the aggregate figure for the economy is already back to the pre-pandemic level.
But this sector is not.
Then the question arises, if so, why is it that trade and transport in particular, both of which are inputs into production processes?
Why is that not back?
Why is that not back?
What's your answer?
I don't know.
Oh, that's the problem for the government. They don't know either.
Well, the government has very much more sources of data and information than I do.
But they're not acting to push it back to that level, are they?
Well, I haven't heard anything.
This is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If they do know, they're not acting. And if they're not acting, one presumes they don't know what to do. And once again, we've identified the problem. Just as we identified the problem with the informal credit system, we just don't know what to do about it.
Yes.
So this is particularly worrying. We have two areas of the economy where we've identified the problem, but we or the government don't know what to do about it.
Yes. Now, hotels and restaurants are a different ballgame because those are final consumer services, right? I mean, it's not an input into anything. And that part of the weakness actually, I think, partly reveals the fear of the disease.
But is it still continuing?
I suspect it is.
But in every other way, life seems to come back to normal. Look at the crowds thronging India Gate to see Kartavya Path.
No, I think that. So I suspect that will come back to the extent that the incomes permit it to come back.
That's the other problem.
That's the other problem. And that's the one that
takes us right back to the informal credit system,
and
MSMEs and transport.
That's right.
So it's becoming a sort of vicious circle where we've identified two problems, but we don't know the solution. But those problems themselves are creating further problems, which can't be solved until these prior problems are solved.
Yes, by and large, I would imagine so.
Let's come to another issue that faces the government. Construction, I believe, is the second largest employer in the country. It's just 1% above pre-pandemic levels. Manufacturing, according to the recent results, was only 4.8% year-on-year better than last year. Do we have problems on both fronts?
Well, yes. On construction, I'm less worried because there was a weakness in the construction sector all along.
And it continues.
It continues. But the fact that we are above the pre-pandemic level itself is a source of some
But just by
comfort.
1%.
Whatever. At least we're there. As you said, trade and transport are not.
You're more worried about manufacturing not growing faster.
Not growing faster.
Why?
The point is manufacturing is a sector which should have bounced back fairly quickly. It had everything going for it. The fact that it hasn't bounced back that fast, it's bounced back certainly, but it could have done a lot more.
Why hasn't it bounced back faster?
Because again, I suspect, and again, we do not have the data on it, is we have no idea how much capacity in the MSME sector has died and has not been revived.
We're back again
We're
to
back
the
again
informal credit system. We're back
Well,
again.
a lot of it may not in fact be even informal. It could be formal. So if you think about it, other than that window that was given for I think it was first for 6 months and then 9 months on the moratorium on loan repayment. After that, the moratorium went, and I suspect a lot of these units were unable. So remember, when we got into the second wave of the pandemic, all of this happened during the first wave. During the second wave of the pandemic, the moratorium was not extended.
So we helped them initially and then forgot about them.
Then forgot about in the second wave.
Then let me ask you directly.
So I think a lot of death has taken place there.
So let me ask you directly, because the problem with the manufacturing side, which has only grown 4.8%, seems to link up, you feel, with what has happened to MSMEs. And I imagine what's happened to the wider unorganized sector where a lot of workers come from. we don't have a clear idea about MSMEs in the unorganized sector. What's your hunch? Your hunch is the credit flow system has meant that many have died. But how much worse is it?
The problem is that the credit linked guarantee scheme addressed only the working capital problem. So firms which were producing and were running into working capital problems were helped, right? There was no scheme which actually helped in creating new companies, new activities. So
for 2 years, no new MSMEs have been encouraged by the system.
That's my suspicion, yes. And the banking data seems to suggest that if you look at the last 2 years, there have been virtually no term lending to the MSME sector.
But then this suggests something that is particularly worrying, because if for 2 years the system hasn't encouraged new MSMEs to emerge, and at the same time the flow of credit stopped after the second pandemic, and therefore MSMEs became static or died, then has the MSME sector shrunk?
I suspect it has. I suspect it has shrunk quite substantially.
Which is one reason why jobs have become such a problem.
Jobs have become a problem, and even what the jobs that are being measured, if you're looking at the data, what you find is that there's been a huge increase, absolutely huge increase, in informal entrepreneurial activity, which are survival activities.
Not really jobs.
They're not really jobs.
I'll come to jobs in a moment's time, but the MSME shrinking explains why manufacturing is growing so slowly.
Yes. So what's happening is MSMEs shrinking. The corporates have been taking over that space. Corporate investments tend, simply because of the size and scale at which they operate, take time to come on stream.
And we're in the lag period.
And we're in the lag period.
Let's look directly at jobs. The Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy said that the unemployment rate in August was 8.3%. The Indian Express a couple of weeks ago reported that for every single month of this financial year, demand for NREGA was substantially higher than it was in the corresponding period of the last pre-pandemic year. That clearly, to me, suggests that jobs and unemployment are not just a continuing problem, but very possibly a worsening problem.
Well, it's hard to be definitive about that. And the reason is, one fact that we do have is that during the lockdown, we had a massive reverse migration of workers back to rural areas. Now, there is some evidence that they're trickling back, but it's still a trickle. So what I suspect is that there is a large number of people who were in urban areas and in urban jobs pre-pandemic, who went back to their villages and have just stayed there, because I think the fear continues.
Which is why NREGA demand has gone up.
And these people had no other jobs earlier. I mean, they're not working in the rural areas, they're working in urban areas. So once they go back, how do they occupy themselves?
But the reverse migration and a boost in agricultural employment is not something the economy should be looking forward to and welcoming.
Not in the least. In fact, we should be deeply worried about that.
And this is also why, NREGA has gone up. Its demand for every single month of this year is considerably higher than the demand was for the last pre-pandemic year.
Sure.
But it also is one reason why urban employment, which keeps MSMEs going, has fallen and shrunk.
This is right.
In fact, one of the facts that I noticed in the Times of India yesterday, Sunday, is that the National Crime Records Bureau now says that suicides by daily wage workers account for 25% of all suicides. Apparently in 2014, they only accounted for 12%. If 8 years later they account for 25%, it means in 8 years they've more than doubled. That is a sign of distress for these people.
Yes, it is. And again, Karan, you and I are urban animals. Where do you think the casual workers get their jobs? It's not corporates.
It's MSMEs and the unorganized sector.
This is right. if they are suffering, these daily, their hardly work is down.
This is where the shrinkage of the MSME sector leads directly to joblessness, to daily wage workers committing suicide, and to literally a hand-to-mouth living for our citizens.
This is correct.
So then let me ask you, I get the impression from everything we've discussed that we seem to have got locked into a K-shaped recovery. And it seems that the arms of the K are moving further and further apart.
Yes, it is. And at the heart of that movement, I mean, other than that initial period that we'd already talked about, is the fact, and I think we are not paying enough sufficient attention to it, is that the financial sector has become vastly more formalized than it was 3 years ago. All right? And the formal financial sector is not particularly MSME friendly. And nothing has been done up to now to try and ensure that the formal financial sector meets the kind of financial needs that the informal was meeting earlier.
Which is why we have this
Which is why you have the K-shaped recovery.
And it's going divergent.
And it'll be divergent because the formalization of finance is continuing to gain pace.
So it seems we have 3-4 critical problems with our economy. One, that important services sector, transport, trade, which accounts for 30.5% of employment, it's 15.5% below pre-pandemic levels, and we're just not sure what to do about it. MSMEs, which have probably shrunk, and as a result of which jobs have disappeared. And once again, we simply don't know how to get the informal credit lines flowing to build them up again. And as a result of that, we also have people without money, not spending, consumption not happening, and therefore no incentive for investment.
Yes, and the investment story gets a little bleaker given what's happening globally. If global stress continues for any extended period, then there will be, I think, significant impact on our investment intentions.
But you know, and I'm repeating what I said earlier, we've identified fairly clearly what are the key problems. We've also said we're not quite sure what to do about them. And it occurs to me that if you've identified them, the government would have identified them, and the government would also know it doesn't know what to do about them. It won't admit it, but it knows it.
You know, this is the thing. The government has very clearly, I mean, they've said so in so many words, they've put their whole emphasis on infrastructure development.
In the hope that that will boost the economy.
In the hope that it will boost the economy. That's fine. Infrastructure is important.
But it
is more important for the MSMEs than it is for the corporates. So up to that extent, it's good. But if there's something else which is holding the MSMEs back,
that's not being addressed.
And that's not being addressed, then making things better on the infrastructure front may not give you the response that you expected.
And the other thing is, if it were even to give the response, it would do so after a lag of a year or two.
Of course.
By which time the MSMEs will have suffered even more, joblessness would have increased, consumption would have gone down, and we'll be spiraling lower and lower.
Well, I suspect not. I suspect we will probably be able to hang around that 4%, 4.5% growth mark.
Cling on to it desperately.
Yeah. Whether we'll be able to ramp it back up to the 6.5%, and that should be our objective.
But this is a pretty bleak picture we're ending up with. We know the problem, and we know we can't do very much about it. We're trying to tackle it by boosting infrastructure. But there's a real likelihood, as you said, that if the real problems that are holding back MSMEs are not tackled, boosting infrastructure may not make such a big difference to them.
No, it will certainly make a difference to the MSMEs that continue to exist.
But not the others.
But not the others.
It won't create the new MSMEs
the new
you
MSMEs,
need,
that's the
which
point.
means you won't create the jobs you need, which means you won't boost the consumption you want to boost.
Correct. That's exactly it.
Well, we have a really bleak situation on our hands, I have to tell you that.
Yeah, it is not a pleasant scenario.
Not a pleasant in the circumstances is a euphemism. It is pretty bad.
Well,
I mean,
yes.
we have a problem, we don't know how to tackle the problem, and that problem could get worse.
Yes, and this is why I said that at the end of the day, policy responses depend upon diagnosis. To date, I have not heard from the government any articulation of the nature of the problem and their diagnosis of the problem.
But now you're saying something that's perhaps even worse. You're now suggesting that the diagnosis you've given me about MSMEs, about trade and transport, about jobs creation, about starting up MSC, this diagnosis has not been made by the government.
It may have well been made,
But not talked
but
about.
it's not being articulated.
But if it's been made, I presume they would have articulated it because it's not a trade secret. The government needs to give confidence they know what's wrong.
No, I mean, let's be clear. I think we are now in a situation where the only articulation by the government on economic matters is the economic survey. There is no other articulation that I know of.
What you're saying is we don't really know for sure whether the government has diagnosed the problem or not because the government doesn't talk about it.
We hope they know.
We hope behind their silence.
And we will know when the next economic survey comes out.
But this is again very worrying. The government's silence means we don't know whether they've diagnosed the problem. We hope they have, but we could be completely wrong because their silence could be interpreted in multiple ways.
It could be. That's a problem with silence. You can interpret it any way you like.
But against this very bleak background, how then do you respond to the euphoria that India has overtaken Britain and become the fifth largest economy? That euphoria swept through our country with the Prime Minister himself boastfully claiming that we had undone the shackles of slavery.
Yes. Look, you always celebrate anything you can at bad times. That's how we are as human beings. And look, Britain has a special place in our hearts, our collective hearts. The fact that we are now larger than Britain allows us to do something we really couldn't do earlier, which is thumb our noses at them.
But you began very interestingly. We always find things to celebrate when the situation is bad. This was a deflection away from the reality.
Yeah, but then, also remember that one of the reasons we actually went past Britain is because Britain did very badly the last year.
If it improves, it could reverse the situation.
Well, that depends. I don't think they're going to be able to improve to 4% plus.
But let me point something else out. If you look at the two GDPs in per capita terms, Britain is just over 20 times bigger than us.
This is right.
If you look at us in terms of the government's own minimalist poverty line, at least 21% are below it. But the truth is, pretty close to 50% of the Indian people live in depressing poverty. Can we therefore really meaningfully compare the British and the Indian economies?
In terms of your presence in the global economy, yes. In terms of what you've done for your citizens,
no.
I think they're two different worlds.
Our standard of life is nowhere near the British standard of life.
Nowhere close.
We're coming right to the end of this interview. I want to touch on two other things with you. One of the challenges the government faces, and it affects exports, because exports are important. They've been a boost to our economy, although it seems that may not be the case.
No, that's already started tailing off.
That's already started tailing off. Now, one of the concerns the government has is the falling rupee. This year, between February and September, 80 billion of our reserves have been used to shore up the rupee, 20 billion of which were used in August alone. Is this a wise way of using our reserves, or do you agree with Dr. Subbarao, the former RBI governor, who told the Indian Express today, let the rupee depreciate, only intervene to curb volatility, don't stop the decline?
I think every sensible economist has been saying this. Okay? And Karan, let me again make it very clear. The rupee has depreciated against the dollar. We have appreciated against every other major currency. All right? Now, in a situation of this kind, I think it would be much more useful not to talk about the rupee depreciating, but to talk about the dollar appreciating. It would make life easier for all of us. The dollar has appreciated against everybody. We have appreciated against all other major currencies. So we have, in effect, if you look at it in terms of our trade, right, it's quite likely about 50% of our trade we have actually appreciated, which makes us actually uncompetitive. So yes, the rupee should be allowed to depreciate further.
So are we unwisely using our reserves to shore up the rupee?
Well, I don't know whether it's unwisely or not, because let's face facts. Given the kind of volatility we are seeing in global markets, the 80 billion could have gone in just managing volatility.
So it's not necessarily simply to shore up the rupee.
The rupee, yes.
My last question, I'll go back to the Business Standard. On the 1st of this month, they said we need broad-based reforms to boost the economy's growth momentum. Do you agree?
Karan, it's very easy for commentators to say we need broad-based reforms because you're not having to articulate what those reforms are. It would serve a much more useful purpose if you could say what reforms you're talking about and why you're talking about it.
Can you?
The government can certainly turn around and say, yes, we agree that we should do broad-based reforms, and we are doing it.
But we haven't defined what they are.
Neither have you defined it, nor have we defined it.
So this is a bit of a chimera.
So this is where the communication between government and whoever are the other protagonists is so important. The government does need to communicate.
So we come back as we end this interview, not to the need for broad-based reforms, because as undefined terms, everyone would agree we need them, but since no one has defined what they are, there's no need
and to which end?
And to which end?
Which end? That's the starting point.
But are there any that you yourself would recommend?
Yes.
What are they?
Do something like the credit-linked guarantee scheme for term loans to MSMEs. That is, try and get the banks to fill the areas that the informal credit market used to fill.
And this would tackle the informal credit flow that we've talked about.
This is right.
Are there similar broad-based reforms that would help the transport trade sector, which is...
Transport, remember, the transport sector in India is a part of the MSME sector.
So this would help that as well?
This would help that as well.
So the main thrust of the reforms that you think we need are reforms that rejuvenate the MSMEs, reforms that help new MSMEs come on the market.
That's the main part of it. Rejuvenating the existing MSMEs, I think a fair amount has been done. But to allow and encourage new MSMEs to come in,
that hasn't happened.
That hasn't happened.
And that's where we're not sure whether the government has diagnosed the problem or not. Its silence, as we've agreed, could mean anything.
It could, yeah, we don't know.
Professor Sen, for this comprehensive understanding, even if it leaves us with a very bleak picture of the future, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.